So what I do with my tomato plants is the first thing that I do is I make sure that there is nothing brown or dead on them. After I have planted them and they have been in the ground for a few days and they've had time to get established, then I usually go through and snip off some more of the bottom. If there's any leaves that are touching the dirt, I like to snip that off because it can get mold, fungus, anything can happen to it whenever the leaves begin to touch the ground. And so it just makes them more susceptible to disease and even bugs. So I go through and I snip off anything like that. Sometimes I just pinch it off with my finger. But it's better if you use some little snips or something if you have them. If you don't, be sure not to pinch and pull, because if you pull down and it strips that stalk, then it's really going to be susceptible to some disease. So I'm going to flip the camera around and show you what I'm talking about. So here is my Campari tomato. It was one of the first ones that I put in. So you can see that it's pretty tall already. It's the one that really needed some support. So I did already trim some of the bottom off. And so now I'm just going to go through and I'm going to look for suckers. And I'm also going to look for anything dead or brown that needs to be trimmed off. So this leaf right here is kind of close to the ground, so I'll just snip a piece of that off. Actually, I'm going to go up a little bit higher. Now these bottom leaves, once the plant begins to mature and gets a lot bigger, those bottom leaves will not even catch sun rays anyway, because the top of it begins to form and get so big that it just completely shades the bottom leaves. So don't worry about snipping those off and them not being able to have enough leaves to be able to get energy, because they get plenty. Some brown on these leaves over here, so I'll snip those off. Sorry, I'm not the best with this camera while I'm trying to snip the tomato. This one here, look how bushy this one is compared to the Campari. That one's a lot different. So we're going to look through here and see what needs to be trimmed off. So a lot of the bottom for sure. It has a lot of growth on the bottom that's touching the ground. I don't like for the leaves to touch the ground. This one already has already had several suckers. I'm going to show you another one right here. This one right here. See how it's growing out of the armpit? I'm going to go ahead and snip that one off. There we go. Down here's another one. This one right here. I'm going to snip that one off. So what you're doing when you snip all of this stuff off the bottom, you're creating a place for them to have good airflow. And the more airflow they have, the less susceptible they're going to be to disease. There's another sucker right there in the middle. I may just let that one go. I'm trying to get all of this stuff off the bottom. Okay, that's looking better. This one is still, because a sucker had begun to form right here. When that happens, it causes the bottom limb of where the sucker is coming out at, it causes it to go downward. And so when it does that, if it's close to the ground, of course, it's going to touch the ground. But I don't think we're going to need that one anyway, so I'm just going to take that whole thing off. There's another one. And another one. So I've actually trimmed quite a bit off of that one, but I'm going to let it go with what I have here. You don't want to trim too much off of them at once because it can cause them to go into shock. And these have really just begun to be established. Let's look at one more. Okay, this one is on the mortgage lifter. And the mortgage lifter, it is a different kind of tomato. You can see it's growing very differently than the one we just looked at. It already has a tomato on it too. Isn't that exciting? Look at that. Whoop, whoop. So this one's getting a sucker too. And instead of just trying to get the snips in there, I'm just going to pull that one off my finger. I take my fingernail and I pinch it with my fingernail so that it doesn't strip the stalk. Up here's another one. I'm going to do the same thing. Pinch that one off. And I see one more little tiny one starting to grow over here. See how small that one is? Right there. Little tiny one. So if you catch them really small, that's the best time to get them. So another thing that I do to help my tomatoes, whenever they start getting tall, they get top heavy and they start to lean over. So you almost always have to stake a tomato. So I like cattle panels. And so if you'll look behind me here, you'll see where I have put up this cattle panel. And you'll see the T-post right there. And so what I've done is I've just used 3 T-posts and I've put them up. Let me swing the camera around, I'll show you better. So I have 5 tomato plants for this one cattle panel. You can see them there, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so these cattle panels are, I think, 16 feet long. So that's pretty long, and you could actually probably do 1 or 2 more, on a 16-foot cattle panel. I like for mine to be spaced out. I like for mine to get plenty of air because, like I mentioned a minute ago, the more airflow you get for your tomatoes, the less susceptible they are going to be to sickness and disease. And honestly, that's what takes tomatoes out a lot of times. A lot of times they don't even make it to the first freeze because blight has hit them or some kind of powdery mildew or something like that. It's real prevalent in this area and it loves to get on tomatoes. So the next thing I'll do is I'll put up another cattle panel or 2 to get the rest of these staked up. And you may want to keep in mind that pruning is not a one and done job. Pruning is something that you will do throughout the time that you are growing tomatoes. This one down here, that real bushy one, that is the one that I trimmed earlier in the video. And it is already bushy again. So that's been a little over a week ago because I started this video before I went on vacation. So especially when you get a lot of rain. Right after a lot of rain is probably the most important time to go out and check your plants. The rain makes them grow It's like a little growth spurt is what the rain does to them. All that nitrogen, they love it. Right here's a perfect example. That tomato has fell over. So I'll need to go out and stake it. That is the only one left that does not have a stake or some kind of support. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're staking your tomatoes, these little stakes that I have here, these wooden ones, these will not last very long. They're not going to be strong enough to hold these tomato plants. These tomato plants will outgrow these probably in no time flat, 3 or 4 weeks, and they will have outgrown these. But now these cattle panels, on the other hand, they are very strong. I have fixed them so that they're very tall. But when you stake your tomatoes, you have to keep in mind your tomatoes do not have tendrils or anything that will grab on to a trellis or a cattle panel or anything else. So you have to use string to tie them to it. And you can do that multiple different ways. Sometimes I will just wrap a piece of string around it and then tie the string to the trellis. But typically as they grow, you have to readjust and readjust and readjust. Lots of different ways you can do it. These determinate tomatoes, I have 2 of those. I have a Roma and I have a San Marzano that may not ever need anything except to just lean up against the trellis because they do not grow like the indeterminate tomatoes. They don't grow all season. They also do not produce all season. Their growth and their production is predetermined. I'll tell you something else that you need to look out for, especially after a rain, because the tomatoes grow, and when they do, leaves start touching the ground. So it's not quite so bad where I have the weed fabric down, but in places where you do not have weed fabric and it's going to touch the dirt, it makes them susceptible to disease. So just bear that in mind. Another thing to consider when growing tomatoes is fertilizer. Now, I don't fertilize my tomatoes a whole lot through the year. What I really try to do instead, just because it's easier, I work 40 hours a week and I don't have a whole lot of time to invest in doing extra steps that I wouldn't have to do if I had done something a different way. So what I like to do is I like to put a mixture of different things down in the hole of the tomato and then mulch heavily on top of it. So what I put into the hole, I put in compost, which will feed the plants. I put in magnesium, which will feed the plant magnesium, and I use it in the form of Epsom salts. I also use calcium in the form of lime pellets. And then I will also put a handful of 10-10-10 fertilizer into the hole, and I mix all of that up so that the fertilizer itself is not touching bare roots of my plant. So I use the granular fertilizer, and that feeds the plants for quite a while. Sometimes I will hit them with a little bit of liquid Miracle Grow if it looks like they're being stressed out, or if they're just not growing right. If I see something wrong and I don't know what's wrong, that's the first thing I do is just grab a little bit of Miracle Grow and use it. But I don't fertilize a lot throughout the year, and mine still do great. A lot of people use a different variety of fertilizers. A lot of people use the Miracle Grow like I do. Some people use all organic. Some people say that Miracle Grow is not organic. I don't know. I've not really done a lot of research on that, but I just know that it has worked for me in the past. And I don't use it to the point that my plants rely on it. I like for them to rely on what is in the soil. So if you give your plants a good foundation in the soil, then, the hope is that that is all that they'll need throughout the year. So that's how I fertilize my tomatoes normally. One of the things that I have picked up from a lady that I love to watch, her name is Jess on Roots and Refuge. She's a homesteader. One of the things that I have picked up from her that I love to say, because there is so much truth in it, not to mention enjoyment, but first and foremost, the very most important thing. As a matter of fact, it is the most important thing that you can do for your garden, and it is give it some time with the gardener. I think she actually says the best medicine for the garden is the gardener, and I have found that to be true. You can walk out into the garden, and in just one glance, you can see what your plants need, just at a glance. So the very best thing for your garden is you. Not to mention, I did see an experiment that was done on 3 different plants, and each one of them had something different, a different atmosphere. One had words of affirmation pumped into it through a speaker. One of them had words of discouragement and negative words pumped into it through a speaker, and then one of them had nothing. And the plant that thrived was the one that was having the words of affirmation, and all of the positive things that go along with a good atmosphere. So just spending time with your plants, interacting with them. I'm not telling you to go out there and start talking to your plants. I don't talk to mine, but I do like to go out into the garden and spend time with them. And there's nothing better for your garden. And another thing to keep in mind when growing tomatoes is mulching. Mulching is so important. Mulching helps to retain moisture in the soil. Moisture also helps to keep the roots cool on these real hot summer days. Tomatoes, when it gets above 90, especially if it's for a prolonged period of time, tomatoes drop their blooms. So one of the things that you can do to help keep the actual temperature of the plant a little lower is to mulch heavily, because it helps to keep the soil cool underneath the mulch. The mulch is a protectant. Another thing about mulch is that it just looks good. Mulch really looks good. Let me turn the camera around and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Here's the mulch that I just put down a few days ago. This is a double ground mulch. The reason I use the double ground is because it breaks down a little bit quicker into nutrients for your plants. I mulched the potatoes with straw, and that's another whole story. You can watch a potato video if you want to know more about that. But anyway, after I mulched the tomatoes, eventually I will have the whole garden done like this. This is my area that has the tomatoes in it. After I put down the double ground mulch, not just around the tomatoes, but even in the rows to help retard the growth of weeds, I took the weed fabric and put it down over top of it. I just cut slits to go around all of the tomatoes. And I plan on doing the whole garden like that. And so that is just going to add another layer of protection to help keep the roots of the tomatoes nice and cool. So I'm going to continue pruning and picking off suckers and say goodnight. So I hope you all have enjoyed the content that I've put out. If you do, please like and subscribe and share the video. You know the routine. That helps my channel. It helps to support it. So I hope you all have a great night. If you have any questions or concerns, if you know me, private message me. If you don't, put a message in the comment area. I'll be glad to answer any questions, and I'll be glad to give more information. So I hope you all have a great night. God bless you.